So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this talk on Towards Conscientious Bilingual Description on the British Library Qatar Foundation Partnership. I'm Victoria Parkinson. I am the chair of the ARLIS Cataloguing and Classification Committee. The Art Library Society UK and Ireland, ARLIS, is a membership society and we support and enrich the profession by fostering greater engagement and understanding of the work and contributions of art libraries and librarians. If you're interested in supporting our work, please consider becoming a member. You can find information on arlis.net. Today's event is organised by the Cataloguing and Classification Committee as part of a series of talks we're hosting on cataloguing and classification ethics. We've just added two more talks to the series, which are on our Eventbrite page now, if you haven't seen them. Thank you very much to the other members of the committee for organising this talk. At the end of the presentation, there'll be time for questions. So if you put them in the Q&A box as you think of them, I'll read them out at the end for Kirsty and David to answer. But let me hand over now to my fellow committee member, Annalisa, to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Victoria. And good evening all, and welcome back to our sixth appointment with our Cataloguing and Classification Ethics series. I'm Annalisa Ricciardi. I'm a member of the ARLIS Cataloguing and Classification Committee and a cataloger for the Americas and Oceania office at the British Library. Work in progress towards conscious bilingual description on the Qatar Digital Library is the title of today's talk and is presented by two members of the British Library Qatar Foundation Partnership, Kirsty Reid and David Woodbridge. In 2014, together with the Qatar Foundation and the Qatar National Library, the British Library launched the Qatar Digital Library, a free online portal that provides access to material from its collections related to the Islamic world, the Arabic cultural heritage, and the modern history of the Gulf. A vast collection of personal papers, manuscripts, maps, photographs, visual arts, sound and video, as well as Arabic scientific manuscripts, and over 9,000 individual items from the India office records. The portal is fully bilingual, supporting study in both Arabic and English. Let's have a look at our speakers. So Kirsty is a Gulf history cataloger at the British Library Qatar Foundation Partnership Programme. She holds an MSc in Information Management and Preservation at the University of Glasgow. She has held cataloguing and project archivist roles at a variety of institutions, including university, local authority, and private archives. Her interests include international bilingual archives, community-based archives, and conscientious description. David is a Gulf history cataloger at the British Library Qatar Foundation Partnership Programme. He is an historian of British imperialism with particular interests in China and the Persian Gulf. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Manchester and has completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Xiamen University in China. He has worked on archive projects at King's College London, the National Archives of the UK, and the British Library. Since the summer of 2020, the British Library Qatar Foundation Partnership has sought to engage critically with the language and the terminology found in the records. Starting from important existing resources such as Words Matter Glossary, a team of catalogers and translators has looked at terms in English and Arabic and has developed a consistent approach to treating each term in the processes of cataloging and translation. This project is ongoing and includes the development of the Qatar Digital Library's transliteration database and glossary and aims to provide definition and historical context to better assist an online global audience. Kirsty's and David's talk will outline the approaches to this work, the challenges faced, and benefits gained. So I think for those of you who don't know about the Words Matter Glossary, I think I'm going to pop the link in the chat. Sorry for the long presentation, but I think it was a great idea to say more about this amazing and important project. And the words to you now, David and Kirsty. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Victoria and Annalisa, for that welcome. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen and start the presentation. Hopefully you can all see that. So good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Kirsty Reid, and as Annalisa said, both myself and my co-presenter David Woodbridge are cataloguers on the British Library Qatar Foundation Partnership Programme. Before we start, we just want to thank the Art Libraries Society for inviting us to talk today, and to also thank them for organising such a brilliant series of talks on a very important subject. So today we're going to tell you a little bit of some of the work we've been doing over the last while to engage more conscientiously with some of the material we work with on the Qatar Digital Library. And before we begin, we just wish to warn you that this presentation contains some outdated and offensive language. So the structure for today is we'll start by introducing the project that we work on, who we are and what we do. We'll then briefly mention some transliteration work that we've been doing before discussing the main topic of this talk, which is our Conscientious Bilingual Description project. Lastly, we'll go over some of the outputs and outcomes of this work, and we'll share some resources at the end. And just before we begin, as the title of the talk indicates, this is a work in progress. So our aim today is to share what we've done so far and how we went about it, in the hope that this might be helpful to anyone else looking to start their own investigations into their collection's content. So as we have a lot of ground to cover, I'll just start by giving you the headlines of what you need to know. Firstly, the programme that we work on is a partnership between the British Library and the Qatar National Library, which comes under the umbrella of the Qatar Foundation. So the project is based around a large-scale digitisation project of archival material from the British Library that relates to the Persian Gulf region, as well as Arabic scientific manuscripts. With most material coming from the India office records. The digitised material is hosted on the Qatar Digital Library, or the QDL, which is an open access website which is totally bilingual. So as this snazzy GIF shows, we have our own in-house translation team, so everything we write for the QDL is available in both English and Arabic. As these recent stats demonstrate, the QDL is regularly visited with users from around the Arabic-speaking world, and we have a good spread of visitors using the Arabic and English interfaces. So David and I are part of a cataloguing team of around 14 people, and the large size of this team means that we are able to provide detailed catalogue descriptions. And these are published alongside the digitised copies of the records on the QDL portal. However, we do want to establish right now at the beginning of this talk that although we are both cataloguers, the work we're going to talk about today has been produced by a collaborative team of cataloguers and translators. Translators feed into our cataloguing process and are essentially a second review stage, often giving feedback and making suggestions. So we want to note that their editorial, linguistic and cultural expertise were crucial elements of the work we're presenting today. As we said, the portal is targeted to a global audience, and we've always been aware of the responsibility we have to make the records as accessible as possible to a diverse range of users. This is made more challenging by the fact that these are colonial records created by British officers and officials, written in English and predominantly from a British imperial perspective. One of the ways we've tried to do this is by making particular efforts to correctly identify the people groups and individuals who feature in the records and who are often misidentified or their names are very roughly rendered. This is something we have always tried to do, but recently we've sought to establish a more formalised process for this. So a key part of this has been establishing a streamlined approach to transliterating names from non-Latin script languages, particularly Arabic. As catalogers, we will typically encounter these names in the records in obscure Romanized forms that make it difficult sometimes to determine what the name was in the original language. In the past, as catalogers, we did our best to follow these spellings with a transliteration that follows Library of Congress conventions within square brackets. but the practice was not consistent, and without a centralised database, inaccuracies were likely to slip through. So as I said, we're fortunate, very fortunate in our project to have an in-house Arabic translation team. And our cataloguing team also has specialists in Persian, Turkish, and various Indian languages. So we now have a process established using SharePoint as the program's workflow management system, where a cataloger can submit details of a name they're uncertain about, and the translation team will provide a correct transliteration, which is then added to a database for future reference. This improved process helps us fulfill our responsibility towards our users in several ways. First, it increases the discoverability of these individuals and groups, allowing users to identify them more easily in the records, and so assisting their research. But it also aligns with our conscientious approach as a form of respect towards people whose names had been distorted by the record creators. Furthermore, it serves to enhance the presence of these people in the records, and this is particularly important in the context of colonial records, in which local people are often in the background or not clearly identified. So this will allow users to bring to light the full range of stories that these records contain. So this was one part of our existing practice that we have made more formalised and consistent. But the main thing we want to focus on now, and for the remainder of the talk, is this new project that we've developed that seeks to address problematic and offensive language that appears in the records and our catalogue descriptions. So I'll just pass on to David to introduce this project.
Okay, so inspired by the work of others, such as the Words Matter Glossary produced by the National Museum of World Cultures in the Netherlands, and also enabled by lockdown to devote more time to this issue, a project team of cataloguers and translators began investigating the presence of problematic terms in our project. So our main motivations were to ensure that users would not encounter harmful or offensive language without warning, or without anything in catalogue descriptions to indicate that the language used was unacceptable. And we were also concerned about the danger of there not being sufficient distance between the language of the original archival record and the description of the modern record processor. And this was not only because of the harm that might be caused to a reader, but also because of how the description might end up concealing the bias of the record creator or repeating their perspective. So after some research into the existing work being done, we began our own investigations. So we used the Words Matter Glossary referenced on the previous slide as a starter list. Then we added terms based on our own experience and knowledge of the records. Now, to search for these terms in our records and descriptions, we used a combination of existing tools. Now, as well as the QDL's own search function, a tool we used was the search tool within MemoQ, which is the translation management software used by the translation team. Now, this tool is normally used by translators to prevent duplicate work and ensure consistency in translation. So it allows translators to search a string of text and then produces a list showing each time that string of text has appeared in previous translations, meaning that the translators could look up a term and see a snapshot of it in context every time it had appeared in the scope and content fields. The term would also be highlighted in the results, and you can see an example of this in the top right image on this slide. And this made it easy to scan through each instance. However, only the translation team had access to this software. And so a real kind of game changer for the research that we were doing came with the development of a Python script by Sotirios Alpanis, who was our former head of digital operations. So we called this the cataloger's friend, and the script developed was able to search an exported XML of the project's catalog descriptions and produce an Excel of the results of the term's appearance in our scope and content fields. Now, this meant that rather than having a list of shelf marks containing the term, which we would then need to search through one by one, we could now view a list of all the instances of a term across the collection. And as this script was developed in-house, we were able to feed back to Zeterius and ask him to build in elements that would be particularly helpful. So for example, we asked him to write into the code that as well as the full scope and content field of a shelf mark, the Excel output would return a column which padded the term with around 50 characters either side. And you can see an example of this in the bottom right image on the screen. And this was just a useful tool which meant that catalogers could quickly read the term in context without having to go through the full scope and content, which, as we catalog to intermediate level, can often be hundreds of words long. So it's worth noting that the final version of the code was pretty different from earlier iterations, so it did take a bit of time to develop this. So once we had identified a list of terms, we then had to work out how to treat them. And for this, we used a combination of existing recommendations from other studies, as well as developing our own additional layers of treatment, which we will discuss in a bit more detail now. So as we began investigating the terms, it soon became clear that it was rarely the case that a term could be easily identified as being either problematic or not problematic. Rather, it often depended on the context in which a term was being used. So we came up with 4 categories, which you can see here, to help us to work out what treatment was required. And it also became apparent that different types and levels of treatment were needed. In some cases, a simple intervention could be made, but in other cases, a greater variety of approaches were required. Now, the types of treatment we decided on were also determined by the different levels of complexity of each term, which we've tried to illustrate in the graphic on the right. So the less nuanced a term was, the lighter the treatment could be. For example, the use of single quotation marks, or by adding an acceptable modern equivalent in square brackets. But the more nuanced or complex the term, the greater the action that was required, such as adding the term to the QDL glossary or writing a contextualizing article. So we're just going to go through an example for each of the 4 categories listed on the left of the slide in order to give an idea of the breadth of terms and the forms of treatment we've tried to apply. So first, we had terms that we've judged not to be problematic, such as tribe. Now, this term has been flagged in other studies as being problematic because of how it can imply that a society is primitive or pre-modern. But from the research we did, we could see that this was not the case in a Middle East context, because tribe is generally used as the equivalent of the Arabic term Kabila. So there was no need for catalogers to treat this term any differently, but we did advise catalogers not to overgeneralize and to use the specific name of the tribe concerned where possible. So the second category is terms that are only sometimes problematic, such as native. Now, this term is unproblematic if it's being used to describe a relationship between a person and the place they are from. For example, a native of Bahrain. However, we noticed that often in the records, the term native was being applied to groups of people from a variety of places, but without any distinction being made between them. For example, in phrases such as native ships or native rulers, where further research showed that the ships and rulers in question actually came from a variety of geographical areas. So native was essentially being used here as a synonym for non-British or non-European. And the use of the word like this resulted in different colonized peoples being lumped together in an indiscriminate and often demeaning way, which in turn could serve to reinforce the idea of a colonial hierarchy. So for instances such as this, we've recommended that the term is placed in single quotation marks in catalogue descriptions to show that this is the language being used in the records. And it's also suggested that the cataloguer provide further information in square brackets. For example, if the term native rulers is used, this should be followed by the names of these individuals, if known, or with a precise as possible description of the areas which they ruled. The third category is for those terms which, as far as we could tell, are always problematic when they appear in the records. So an example of this are the terms pirate and piracy, which appear frequently in records relating to the Gulf. Now, the labeling of certain Arab tribes as pirates represented a British point of view, and so we've recommended that cataloguers don't use the term in their catalogue descriptions unless they are quoting from the records themselves, in which case it should be placed in single quotation marks. But as we investigated this term more, we decided it needed further explanation for our users, because it was apparent that what was understood by piracy differed among different people and has changed over time. So we'll come back to this term later to show how we went about providing this additional context. So the final category is for the group of terms that we considered to be both problematic and offensive, and therefore needing urgent treatment. Now, an example of this is Mohammedan, which is used in the records by British officials to refer to Muslims or anything related to Islam. And it's considered offensive because it implies that Muslims worship the Prophet Muhammad. So we recommended that cataloguers always place this term within single quotation marks and follow it with Muslim or Islamic in square brackets as appropriate. We also decided to add the term to the QDL's glossary in order to provide further context and explanation for users. So hopefully, as you can see from these examples, terms have unpredictable complexities, and it's required thorough research and careful reflection in order to come up with suitable recommendations for dealing with these terms. So I'm going to pass back over to Kirsty now, who will provide some more detail about the glossary and article spaces on the QDL, and also about some of the outputs and outcomes of this project.
Thank you, David. So thinking back to that triangle graphic, which had the wider forms of treatment for more complex terms, one of the layers of treatment we've mentioned was to add a term to the glossary on the QDL. So I'll just tell you a little bit about our glossary and give an example of a definition to show how the glossary helps us in our efforts to provide more context. So the QDL benefits from a dedicated glossary page on the website, which is laid out like a traditional glossary with terms arranged alphabetically. There's also a hyperlink function. So when a glossary term comes up in a catalogue description or an article on the site, it will be in purple. Users can hover over the term to see a short definition, or they can click on the term, which will take them to the longer definition on the main glossary page. So another project that began in lockdown was a review of our glossary with the aim of increasing the number of terms and improving the consistency in what was included in the glossary. So this coincided nicely with our work on the Conscientious Bilingual Description project because it involved a lot of the same people, namely cataloguers and translators. And as we mentioned before, a big lesson learned when investigating problematic terminology was the amount of nuance involved. Yes, some terms were clearly offensive, but others were only problematic in certain contexts. And one way of trying to capture that nuance is by adding a term to the glossary, as this allows us to explain a little bit more about the term and really situate its uses in the context of our records, if necessary. So, like the Conscientious Bilingual Description project, the glossary review is also ongoing, and so we haven't yet uploaded any of the problematic terms to the glossary page. However, we did want to share this one entry that has been updated, which includes a sentence that we think illustrates how the glossary space can be used to provide context. So, as you can see for this new entry, Al-Qasimi, which is the name of the family which has ruled the areas around Ras Al Khaimah and Sharjah for centuries. The long definition allows us to give quite a bit of detail about this family. Notably, at the end, we've been able to share the important detail that often in the records, the British officials would refer to any seafaring Arabs they suspected of being pirates as part of this family. This speaks to a common theme that came out of our investigation, which was the problematic classifying of distinctive groups together in a generalized and potentially inaccurate way. And in this way, we can, by including this sentence, we can alert users to this potential for inaccuracy in the records, as well as giving insight into practices existing amongst the British officials. So some terms were suited to the glossary because for their use in our records, their nuance could be captured in a paragraph. However, others had a more complex history and were significant enough to the context of our records that we felt more in-depth treatment would be necessary. So for the most complex of terms, we decided to write articles about them. So the QDL has a space for articles written by team members, which can be linked to specific records. There are now over 200 articles on the portal, normally around 1,000 words in length, and they provide introductions to some of the record series that are available, as well as background and analysis of various aspects of the history that the records document. It's a great space for providing more detail about any of our more complex problematic terms, such as the word piracy. Not only does piracy feature very commonly in the records, particularly in the 19th century, but its use is central to understanding the history of the British involvement in the Gulf, as it was used as a justification for military intervention and for an ongoing political presence in the region. In addition to this, the term provides challenges for the translation team. The Arabic word for piracy is relatively modern. However, in the Arabic translations of treaties that we find in the records, a number of other terms are used to express the idea of piracy, suggesting that an equivalent concept didn't exist among the Arab inhabitants of the Gulf at that time. So while the modern Arabic term accurately renders the meaning of the English term piracy, by translating it this way, we're overlooking the perspectives of local populations at the time. So to address these various issues, David collaborated with colleagues from translation to write an article explaining the history of the term and its use in our records, and covering both English and Arabic language contexts. This has allowed us to address in much greater depth the historical and ethical questions arising from the presence of the term in our records, and it's something we plan to do also for other terms in the future. So while the work investigating terms and recommending treatments was equally shared between translators and cataloguers, the fact that our descriptions are translated into Arabic adds a whole other set of considerations that the translation team had to investigate. In other versions of this talk, we've been joined by our translation colleague, Mariam Abolez, whose name we have included in the title slide because she helped create a lot of the content we're sharing today. With Mariam, we might have gone into more detail regarding the extra considerations for the translation team, but we're aware that the in-house translation of material is fairly rare, so we won't go into too much detail today, but we would like to share a couple of important points. Firstly, we wanted to note that any in-text action, such as the use of single quotation marks or square brackets, is mirrored in the Arabic translation, which you can see in the example excerpts here. The second thing to mention, of course, is that creating a catalogue description calls for the interpretation of the primary source. But the description that an Arabic reader encounters on the QDL has an added layer of being a translated text, and therefore has gone through one more cycle of interpretation. Now, translators have a responsibility to produce a translation closely aligned with the English catalogue description, but some terms, even if not immediately problematic in English, can have problematic connotations if they're translated as is. For example, there are frequent references in the records to possessions, which is a technical colonial term meaning territories under the rule of. The direct Arabic translation, Montalaket, invokes connotations of entitlement that can be insensitive to the Arabic reader. So we agreed to avoid using possessions where possible and to spell out its meaning to ensure there are no gaps between the English and Arabic descriptions. So the outcomes of this project so far are 2 new sets of guidelines, one for cataloguers and one for translators. We've identified 40 terms, with each term provided with a note explaining its background and use in the records, and then a set of recommendations for how to treat this term. We intend for these to be living guidelines that can be edited and added to as we become conscious of new terms and meanings. These are still at draft stage as we consult with relevant teams across the British Library and the Qatar National Library, gathering valuable feedback, especially from the India Office Records team. Ideally, our next steps would be to draft a content warning and to convert our guidelines into a public guide or glossary, similar to the one produced by the Words Matter team. So discussions about this are ongoing. So we believe the work that we have done with consolidating transliterations, improving the QDL glossary, and the Conscientious Bilingual Description project so far has many benefits, including some tangible outcomes. The key outcome, of course, is improved cataloguing and translation in the form of more consistency in our practices and more distance between ourselves and the record creators. In addition, the more specific naming of individuals, groups, and locations enhances discoverability on the QDL, and the extra layers of context to the records enriches the user experience. These projects have also helped us consolidate and enhance resources and practices we already engaged in. We were reassured by our research that most cataloguers and translators were already being conscientious about language, and some of the existing practice that we identified fed into our new draft recommendations. These projects also gave us an opportunity to think creatively and use tools already in place beyond the use for which they were originally designed, and to expand the scope of existing resources to cater for a wider set of needs without having to invest in new software or web development. Lastly, we believe these projects help combine the British Library value of putting users at the heart of what we do and the QDL's stated purpose of providing a resource that is for everyone. By expanding the context provided through the glossary and articles, the QDL caters to both new and experienced users. The steps we have taken to address the language in our records is a sign of respect to users and to staff, and we believe the work we have done creates more bridges across the 2 languages of our bilingual site, with improvements that benefit users working in either language. These are some resources and sources that we found useful. Thank you very much for listening. We're aware that was quite a bit of information to receive in a short space of time, so we really look forward to any questions or feedback that you might have. And if you're interested in news from our partnership programme, then please do follow us on Twitter. Thank you.